A good Shabbos and a good Erev Yontif to everybody. It is a pleasure to be here on the Bima, continuing a tradition that has been a part of Eitz Chaim for many, many years. And I'm grateful to Rabbi Drash, who invited me the Shabbos morning to share this tradition with you, which of course is the Ask the Rabbi episode. The numbers of people that are here are, of course, fewer than in previous years for obvious reasons, but hopefully your curiosity will outnumber the numbers that are here. Traditionally, Ask the Rabbi was on Shabbat Hagadol, which this is, the great Shabbos. Shabbos during the course of the year, Shabbat Hagadol was the Shabbos preceding Pesach, on which people could ask the Rabbi questions having to do with the complexity of Pesach preparation. And so, of course, today it's not that complex. It's overwhelming, but it's not complex. But nonetheless, the tradition developed that one could ask questions about any topic or any issue here at Eitz Chaim on this Shabbat Hagadol. And so what I do during the course of the year is I collect questions that people ask me, and I provide the answers to them at the time, but also, of course, at this time as well. And so what I'm going to do is first share with you a question or two asked of me, and then ask if any of you have a question for either myself or Rabbi Drash, of course, and we will go from there, and we will spend, I'll let Rabbi Drash be the timekeeper, okay? So we'll go from there. So let me start with a couple of questions. One asked very recently, and that is, why is yisker, the memorial service, done on Pesach? And the very quick answer to that is, first of all, yisker was done at one time in our liturgical history only on Yom Kippur. But as a result of the Crusades, in which hundreds of thousands of Jews were killed, slaughtered, the Jewish community developed the part of the liturgy where yisker was added for 3 times during the year for the Shalosh Regalim, the 3 festivals of Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. They were the next tier of major Jewish holidays, and to keep up with the announcing and the listing of those who died during the Crusades, the tradition developed that not only on Yom Kippur, when the list of people who passed away in a community was read, it was added to these 3 festivals so that the numbers, which were significant after the Crusades, so that the Jewish communities could keep up with them. So that is the answer. It is not just on Pesach, but Shavuot and Sukkot as well, on which we do yisker. And this began, of course, somewhere in the Middle Ages after the Crusades. So that is question number 1. The next question that I was asked almost very recently also was, if God is a singular God and we believe in monotheism, why does one of God's most popular names, Elohim, end with a Udmam, which implies plurality? Yad is hand, but we talk about Yadayim, Udmam, when we talk about hands, so on and so forth. So the answer to that is, again, very simple. And that is, number 1, perhaps, in the old days, as Hebrew was evolving and our theology was evolving, that the Yud Mem at the end of the word Elohim was some sort of a vestige of very early days, primitive theological days, where there was paganism, where there was idolatry. And so having a Yud Mem at the end of a word that implied a deity was not something that was unusual, because there were a multitude of gods in most faiths. And so somehow maybe it kind of crept into the Hebrew with the term Elohim. That's one. The second explanation is, just because it ends with a Yud Mem does not necessarily mean it is a word of plurality, Elohim. For example, what Hebrew words do we know end with Yud Mem that are not a plural word? Shamayim, the heavens. We wash our hands with Mayim. They end with a Yud Mem, and they are not plural. Similarly, in English, if we would say, what is the last letter that implies plurality? We would say an S. But we know many words in English that end with an S and are not plural words. And so that is the second, in a sense, clue or answer. And the third is that nowhere in the entire Bible, in the entire Jewish Bible, is the noun Elohim ever followed with a verb that is a verb of plurality. In other words, if I would say children are running, I would say Yeladim Ratzim, they're running. In Hebrew grammar, the verb and the noun must match. Whether it's masculine, then masculine, feminine, then feminine, plural, and plural. But nowhere in the entire Jewish Bible is the word Elohim, or any name of God for that matter, but in this case, Elohim, ever followed by a plural verb. It is always a singular verb, and so that, of course, teaches us, reminds us, the singularity of God. So those are two questions asked of me this past week. I will pause for a moment, see if any of you have any curiosities, and if not, I'll continue with what I have accumulated. Any questions? And you can take your mask off. Yes, sir. Andy. Oh, questions in general. Like what's going to happen with the stock market on Monday, or who's going to win the next horse race?
No, but tradition. Last night we went over to my daughter's new house, and we're going to put a mezuzah up on the door. But inside the mezuzah was no parchment. So we heard from a famous Jewish woman, Rabbi, that you can use salt and challah into the house and say your prayers on that. But don't put up the mezuzah without the parchment. So what is all that about?
That entails listening to your mother. That's what it entails. And those are two separate traditions. Number one, when you move into a new home, you put up a mezuzah, and of course, parchment is to be inside. And we are familiar with that. If it's a piece of paper, that does not make the mezuzah a kosher mezuzah. Has to have a kosher parchment inside. Two quick thoughts on that, and then I'll answer a little more pointedly. The other is that when you move into a new home outside of Israel, in the diaspora, you have 30 days on which to put up a mezuzah. You can move into the home, but you don't have to put up the mezuzah right away. You have 30 days. On the other hand, if you move into a new home in Israel, how soon must you put up the mezuzah? Immediately. Why? If you're in Gullus, if you're in the diaspora, you never know what's going to happen when you close on a house, and 30 days later, Anatevka, all sorts of issues we know happen to Jewish people, and so there's an uncertainty in the diaspora. But if you go to Israel and you move into a home, where are you going to go? The home is your home. That's where you're going to be, so the mezuzah goes up quickly. That is the tradition, and that is a halachic tradition, a legalistic tradition, the mezuzah. The others are cute traditions. There are people that will say when you move into a new home, you bring in a broom and you sweep it out to sweep out the shadim, the evil spirits that are there. You bring in a challah, because challah is the staff of life, bread is the staff of life. It signifies also a meal, a place where you eat. Salt also, I won't go into the details, but salt has a mystical power because numerologically, if you multiply the word salt in Hebrew 3 times, it is the equivalent of God's name, and so salt has this spiritual power that is also able to get rid of spirits. There are other traditions also that you bring things into a new home. Again, most of them are bubba mices, but as you know, as we all know, a bubba misa becomes something rooted in the rigidity of tradition. So I hope that answers. And mazel tov to the kids on moving into a home in the area. Okay? Noah.
Why don't you say the prayer for washing your hands the first time at the Seder? Why don't you say the prayer for washing your hands during the Seder the first time?
Why do you wash your hands? What? Why don't you say the prayer? The washing of the hands is done. The question was, why don't you recite the bracha for washing the hands the first time? The answer to that is you wash your hands twice. The first time is symbolic. You sit at the house, and though this might not be politically correct, the tradition that many of us grew up with was we would sit at the table, and the woman or the wife would come to the head of the Seder and symbolically wash the hands, but there's no bracha associated with it because it is just, again, symbolic. It is not the actual ritual of washing one's hand immediately before the meal. Before the meal, we recite the bracha because that is, as we do when we eat bread before a meal, that is the actual bracha associated with the meal. The first one is the symbolic one, which is reflection of freedom, a reflection, again, in the same vein as reclining, relaxing, having our hands washed, which is something that typically Jews did not experience because of persecution, because of their historical condition. And so it's more of a symbolic thing. The second reason, which is not a real reason, but it's a theory that I have that you made me think of, and that is, when do our children typically go up and grab the afikomen? They do it when the folks from the table get up and go in and wash their hands. If they went in and washed their hands and didn't say a bracha, they'd be in and out in a minute. This way, by reciting the bracha, they go in, and there's a period of time which gives the kids an opportunity to hide the afikomen. In our home, my father would go in, he would read one of his sermons from Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur, and that gave the kids plenty of time to hide the afikomen. Okay? I saw a hand in the back. Yes, sweetie. Pull down your mask so I can hear you. What are God's? Oh, okay. I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question. Is God masculine or feminine? The answer is he is neither. God is neither. The minute we define God as a person, as a human being, as masculine, as feminine, as aligned with any particular nation, country, entity, what we have done with God is we have diminished him. We have made him smaller. We cannot conceive of or understand the magnitude, the greatness of God. The way we understand God is by being inspired by God and by seeing the kind of deeds and the creation of righteousness and goodness in this world. So the question, though, is that in Hebrew, we are trapped. We are trapped in Hebrew because you don't have neutral words. So in English, I can say, God said, or God created. The word created, the word said, is not connected to any kind of gender. So there is more authenticity in the verbs associated with God in English than there is in Hebrew. In Hebrew, the grammar insists that there be either a masculine or a feminine verb, pronoun, whatever it is, that matches And so in Hebrew, there is a masculine verb that is associated with God, but it does not imply that God is indeed masculine. In fact, what is the term that we use to refer to God as feminine? Shekhinah. The term Shekhinah we invoke and use, and that is a feminine term that also refers to God, again, reflecting the fact that God is neither gender or he is all genders. Does that explain it for you? What's that? Mask down? I can't hear you. Yes.
So do I just say, like, when I'm talking about God, do I say he, or do I say she, or do I say they?
I see. Excellent. That I didn't understand. And that is, in English, if we are referencing or talking about God, there are people that will say God, he, or God, she, depending on, again, where you are in the politically correct spectrum. But what a lot of liturgy and translations now use is simply the name of God. Many of them will no longer use the term king because a king implies masculine. He, implies masculine. And so in many cases, God will be referred to in something that is neutral, pariv, and that would be referencing him as God. Okay, so I think that's a more accurate answer. Please.
And I'll jump in and say that, sometimes in the prayer book, it's very funny listening to you, Rabbi Lewis, because you've been saying he the whole time, which is interesting.
Yes.
I think in some ways, I grew up in a school, a rabbinical school, where it was in vogue not to use the word he at all, but just to say God. So I would say that the right pronoun for God is God. That's the answer. And there's really no real he, she, or God is just God.
Right. Different generations. Okay. And habit.
It's definitely habit.
Okay. All right. Let me throw in a couple more while we're here. One is tonight, unusual. I think Rabbi Dorsch, how many times during is Shabbos Erev Yontif?
Once every 12 years.
Once every 12 years, we have the challenge of Pesach being Motzei Shabbos, after Shabbos. So one of the issues is Havdalah. What do we do about Havdalah? Again, very simple. First, follow your Haggadah because it's prescribed in your Haggadah. You use a flame, but you do not use besamim. You do not use spices tonight. So it is Havdalah. Again, you follow the text, Havdil, and so on. But it is the text that is in your Haggadah with a kindled flame, with wine, but no spices. Also, let me just take a quick look. Everybody asks me this question every year, and I'm going to give you the quick answer. And that is, of course, about kitniot, beans, and so forth. Historically, and again, I apologize to those out there and those here who know the answer, but again, it bears reminding every year. And that is that in Jewish tradition, the Ashkenazic pattern was not to use rice, beans, corn, and so on. Why? Because in Europe, the custom was that, first of all, for Pesach, you could make Pesach-looking products out of corn, out of rice, and so on, but it might be confused with the regular chametz-stick products, and so it was prohibited. And also, where these grains, the forbidden grains were sold, rice was sold, bean grain was sold, and cornmeal, and so on, and there was a fear that one would contaminate the other. So this was not the dietary culture in Sephardic communities, and so in Sephardic communities, we know these kitniot and so on were not prohibited, only in Ashkenazic communities. In recent years, there has been a realization that that is just not the case any longer, because if you go back historically, and to when we were growing up, what oil did our parents use? Peanut oil, Planters peanut oil. Remember the blue and yellow bottle? And at the bottom it had that little tag, kosher LePesach. And so corn oil, peanut, all these things were at one time as derivatives of that which was prohibited were used, which means intrinsically there was nothing wrong with them. And so now in many communities, even within the Orthodox community, and even in Israel, there is a recognition that kitniot may be eaten now on Passover, on Pesach, and it is not a violation of the restrictions. And so to all of you also, corn oil, any of that stuff, again, certainly purchased before Pesach and before the Bir Chametz, the burning of the Chametz, are not an issue and not a problem. All right?
I would just throw in the custom in our house, which is interesting, is because I can't bring myself to eat kitniot, that we let our kids eat it, and that way they won't have to be stuck on this bubble misa that I have to deal with. I'll also say that I always used to say that I would begin to eat kitniot the second that daylight savings time went away, because they were both, ideas that were crazy for the same reason. Well, now daylight savings time may go away. So let's see how that all plays out.
Okay.
And we'll see what happens.
All right.
All right, thank you, Rabbi.
Oh, I was going to see if they have, I want to give them one more chance. Any questions? Questions? Let me finish with one fast one, only because it's relevant to us every Shabbos, and again, I get this question. And that is, why when we take the Torah out of the Aron Kodesh, out of the Ark, Do we close the curtain and then turn around and so on? The fact is, Torahs are all equal and all the same. If we open the curtain, take out a Torah, turn, and bow in the direction of the open ark, the implication is that the Torah we are holding is less important than the Torah that is in the ark, because we are bowing to the Torah in the ark. And so that is not acceptable. We close the curtain, and when we bow down, there is no such implication. In the same way that when we take out tomorrow and on any holiday 2 Torahs, when the second Torah is raised for Hagbah, what does the person who's holding the Torah on the side do? Stays seated. Because if that person stands with that Torah, what does that imply? Showing respect for the other Torah, but again, all Torahs are equal. And so what we do in Jewish tradition is make sure there is no implication other than that. I thank you, Rabbi Dorsch, for the opportunity. To all of you, Chag Sameach v'Kasher, and to all of you out there in TV land, again, Chag Sameach v'Kasher, a good Yontif. Join us this week here in Shul.